My name is Zara, but for years, that name was ripped from me. In its place, I was given a cold number, 734, and every time I heard that number, it was like someone erased another piece of my soul. It's hard to imagine how a girl raised in a God-fearing home, surrounded by love and tradition, could end up in an isolated cell, facing unthinkable torture. How could a father, who once cradled you tenderly in his arms, look into your eyes and say, "You're dead to me"? It may seem absurd, but that's exactly what happened to me. Today, I share this story not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Because in the midst of suffering, there was light, and that light has a name, Jesus. It all started with a secret, one of those that seems small at first, but changes everything. A secret that led me down paths of betrayal, persecution, and pain. So much pain, I thought I'd never find a way out. You'll hear about how I was ripped from my life, how they tried to erase me, and what happened in that white room, where everything smelled clean, except those men's intentions. But this is also a story of liberation, of a miracle that defied the laws of logic, of a supernatural encounter at the most unlikely moment, and of a choice that broke my heart, but saved my life. If my story touches you, I just ask that you share it. Please leave a comment. I really want to know how this resonates with you, because maybe, like me, you're carrying a silent emptiness inside, one that no one else sees, but that consumes you from within. Now let me take you back to the beginning, before the pain, before the fear, to a time when my life still made sense. My fondest memory of my childhood in Damascus is the smell of jasmine. At night, the scent wafted through the open windows, heralding the arrival of a breeze that softened the suffocating heat of our days. It was a sweet, almost sacred scent, and then there was the call to prayer. The voice echoing from the Umayyad Mosque was part of the soundscape of my soul, as present as my own heartbeat. My routine was predictable, steeped in ancient rituals and traditions passed down from generation to generation. I was the daughter of a respected man, a merchant who was also a pillar of our community. In everyone's eyes, I was the perfect daughter, respectful, devout, discreet. My knees were familiar with the prayer rug I inherited from my mother. I prayed 5 times a day. I bowed my body, recited the right words, did everything right, on the outside. But inside, something was screaming. What began as a mild discomfort grew, transforming into a void that could not be filled. Prayers, once full of meaning, began to sound like words thrown to the wind. What seemed sacred to my mother began to seem distant to me. I wondered, why didn't I feel what they felt? What was wrong with me? This feeling grew silently. No one knew. I didn't even know how to explain it. It was as if my heart was waiting for something, or someone, that I hadn't yet recognized. An empty space, an unoccupied throne. And without even knowing it, I was about to discover who should take that place. For a long time, I felt like a shadow wandering within my own life. I was present in body, but absent in essence. I helped my mother in the kitchen, the warm scent of cumin and coriander filling the air, but my mind was far away. There was a void within me, so deep and silent that even the most familiar scents could no longer anchor me. I began to wonder, was God really real? Or was he just a comforting story we told each other to keep from going mad in the silence? Thinking this caused me overwhelming guilt. It felt like betraying not only my family, but everything that had sustained my world until then. But the doubt persisted. It wouldn't leave me alone. I began to observe the people around me more closely. The men chatting loudly in the market, their laughter full of life. The women on the balconies exchanging confidences as they hung out laundry. Everyone seemed to know exactly who they were, where they belonged, and what they believed. I felt a burning envy, almost like a physical pain. I longed with all my soul for that simple peace, that faith that is unquestioned, just lived. But my mind was a battlefield. Why would an all-powerful God allow so much suffering? Why did his love seem to depend on rigid rules, veiled threats, and blind obedience? These questions hammered inside me like uncomfortable stones. I couldn't swallow them, but I didn't dare spit them out either. I was 18 years old and felt tired, old, strangely out of place among the people I loved most. One night, lying beneath the starry sky of Damascus, that familiar silence enveloped me, and in the midst of the darkness, my eyes fixed on the vastness that enveloped me, a whisper escaped, involuntary, "If you are real, show me." It wasn't a formal prayer, nor something rehearsed. It was the raw cry of a weary soul, and for weeks, then months, it seemed as if nothing had changed. I continued my life, hiding behind my studies. Literature became my refuge. I immersed myself in the ancient poems of our land, verses that spoke of love, loss, desert, and divinity. They touched something within me, but they didn't fill that empty space. They were beautiful echoes, but echoes nonetheless, and I longed for a living voice. It was during this time that I met Nadia. We were in a stuffy classroom, illuminated by the golden light of late afternoon, dust floating in the air and the smell of old books enveloping us. She was unlike anyone I knew. There was a calm about her, not the feigned calm of someone learning to mask their pain, but a true peace, as if she knew exactly who she was, and whose she was. We became friends slowly, the way real friendships begin. We started by exchanging notes, then coffees on the patio, and soon we were talking about everything, about poetry, about how suffocating it was to be young in a world full of expectations, about our dreams and fears. With Nadia, I didn't have to pretend. For the first time, someone truly listened to me, and when she looked at me, I didn't feel empty. I felt seen. But even with this connection, I kept my biggest secret locked away. How could I explain that hole inside me to someone who seemed so whole? How could I tell her I felt lost, even though I was doing everything right? I feared pushing her away. I feared that if I showed her my cracks, she wouldn't be able to bear to see them. But then came that day. We were discussing an old poem about loss and hope, and she said something that made me stop. I commented cynically, almost automatically, that perhaps this was the story of all of us, brief moments of joy swallowed by an eternity of meaningless pain. I expected Nadia to simply nod, perhaps let out a heavy sigh, like everyone else did, but she did nothing of the sort. Instead, he looked at me with those calm, steady eyes, and spoke with a serenity that disconcerted me. What if suffering isn't insignificant, Zara? What if it's exactly what prepares us for a love that can heal us? Those words didn't seem grand, but they echoed within me like a bell that insists on ringing even when we try to ignore it. Love that heals. That paralyzed me. In the world I grew up in, love was something you owed, a bargaining chip, something you maintained with effort, with behavior, with obedience. God, as I knew him, was a scale. Obey, and perhaps he'll accept you. Fail, and you'll suffer. But what Nadia said was different. It was a strange language, and yet something in my heart recognized it, like a forgotten melody, too familiar to be a lie. Weeks passed, but his words lingered. They were like a splinter under my skin, small, nagging, impossible to ignore. Until one drizzly afternoon, sitting under the awning of a cafe in Damascus, I couldn't take it anymore. With my voice almost choked, I asked, "Nadia, where does this peace you carry come from? You look satisfied, like you're not thirsty." She looked at me, and in that moment, I knew she understood what I really meant. It wasn't an ordinary question. It was a confession, a suppressed cry. Her eyes grew serious, and a mixture of fear and tenderness crossed her face. She knew what was at stake. In that city, at that time, some answers were too dangerous to speak. Still, she looked around and leaned in until I could hear her breathing, and whispered, "There's a well, Zara, a well you've never heard of. The water is free, but drinking it could cost you everything." In that instant, my heart raced, as if something sacred had just been revealed. It wasn't a metaphor, it was an invitation, and Nadia knew I was ready to listen. She told me about now, not only as a prophet, but as something more. A man who ate with the despised, who touched the impure, who wept with those who suffered. A teacher who loved the unloved. A God who descended from the throne not to punish, but to walk alongside the broken. And then she told me a story I'd never heard before, but one that felt like it was written for me. The story of a father who ran to embrace the son who abandoned him. A father who demanded no explanations, no penance. He just ran, and embraced, and forgave. That turned my world upside down. I returned home that day with my heart on fire and my mind in chaos. What I had just heard was beautiful and terrifying. It was as if a crack had opened in the wall I had spent my entire life building, and on the other side was light. That night, as the familiar sounds of Damascus echoed outside my window, that image wouldn't leave me. A father running. A dirty, broken son being welcomed with a celebration. A love that didn't need to be bought or earned. A love that existed, simply because it disconcerted me. My father's God was just, yes, but impersonal. He demanded much and rarely smiled. The God Nadia showed me felt like a father who knew me, who waited for me, who saw me, not as I should be, but as I was, in the midst of my pain and confusion. And for the first time in my life, I asked myself, what if this God was real? What if it was for him that my heart had been silently screaming all this time? The thirst for that mirage, for that hidden well, became unbearable. It was as if something had been ignited inside me, and I could no longer extinguish it. For days, I fought against the fear, what I had been taught, what might happen if I took a false step, but nothing was worse than that throbbing emptiness. Then, one afternoon, with trembling hands and my heart pounding, I sought out Nadia in the library. She was hiding behind a stack of books, as if she knew the moment would come. I approached, and in an almost childlike whisper asked, "Can I see the well? Just a sip?" The fear that crossed her face was like a mirror. She knew the weight of it. She knew we were no longer playing with ideas. It was a dangerous choice. It wasn't simply changing my mind. It was risking everything. My reputation, my safety, maybe even my life, and hers too. But then she looked into my eyes and saw my thirst. She saw the desperation of someone who could no longer bear the meaningless existence. She took a deep breath, hesitated for a moment, and whispered, "Tonight, be ready." The hours that followed were the longest of my life. Every shadow seemed to hide someone watching me. Every footstep behind me on the street sounded like a betrayal. As the sun set, and the city plunged into that blue-orange Damascus twilight, Nadia met me on a street corner and led me through a maze of narrow alleys I'd never walked before. It was like leaving the world I knew. We stopped in front of a small fabric shop. The windows were dark, the door discreet, without a sign. Nothing there suggested what lurked behind it. We entered. There was no gold, no incense, no luxurious carpets, nothing like what I imagined when I heard the word sacred. It was just a modest back room, with dim lights, worn pillows, and the smell of dust, wool, and cardamom tea. Yet the air felt different, alive, warm, filled with a sacred stillness. About a dozen people were there, a man with kind eyes and a white beard, a young woman cradling a baby in her arms, a baker with thick, flour-stained hands. Ordinary people, but there was something in their faces, a kind of peace I'd never seen before. When they greeted me, there was no judgment, no analysis, just welcome. For the first time in my life, I wasn't a daughter trying to please, nor a student trying to prove a point. I was just welcome. A man they called Yusef opened an old book. The pages were yellowed, the cover hanging by a thread. It was a Bible. My heart raced. He began to read. He didn't shout. He didn't use harsh words. He simply told the story of a woman who went to a well in the heat of the day, carrying shame, failures, and the feeling of being invisible. He read the words of Now, who told him, "If you drink the water I give you, you will never be thirsty again." Those words pierced through all my defenses. They went straight to the driest parts of my soul. This wasn't religion. It was life. It was exactly what I'd been searching for without even knowing it. Then they began to sing. Their voices were untuned, unrehearsed, but there was a raw sincerity in every note, as if each syllable were being sung directly to the heavens. It was a song about being found, about being loved even when broken, a song about grace. And then, something in me broke. Tears I hadn't even known were bottled up began to fall, silent, warm, cleansing from the inside out. That empty throne inside me, that space that had always been with me, shivered. For the first time, it was no longer completely empty. It wasn't full yet, but I felt your presence. In that small hidden room, surrounded by strangers, I drank my first sip of jellyfish, and everything changed. I knew, with a certainty as sweet as it was terrifying, that I could no longer live without him, that without that living water, my soul would die of thirst. There was no longer any way to unsee what my eyes had seen. Returning home after the secret meetings with Nadia and that small group was like walking between two worlds. I left the silent warmth of that hidden room, where my soul was beginning to breathe, and returned to my home, the same house I'd grown up in. But now, strangely, it felt smaller, not on the outside, on the inside, as if everything there was suddenly too cramped for who I was becoming. That house, which had once symbolized safety, now felt like a cage. Beautiful, yes, but a prison nonetheless. I tried to maintain my routine. I washed the dishes with my mother, sat on the couch while my father talked about the grocery store, participated in family prayers. I did everything as before, or tried, but something inside me had shifted. I could no longer act as if nothing had happened. My mother was the first to notice. Her instincts were sensitive, as only mothers are. "You're different, my daughter." Very quiet. She touched my forehead, as if checking for fever, but what was burning inside me wasn't my body. I forced a smile. How could I explain that my silence was reverence, not illness? That for the first time in my life, I was listening to something bigger than the world around me. But my father, he was more observant, harder. During dinner, I noticed his gaze grow more attentive, more heavy. He didn't ask questions, but analyzed. He noticed everything, especially in the prayers. My lips still moved, out of reflex, out of fear, perhaps out of respect. But the fire he so admired, that mechanical, demanding fervor he taught us to call faith, was no longer there. Little by little, I became an actress who forgot her lines, and he, a director who realized the stage was no longer my home. Tension gathered in the air like clouds before a storm, until, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the rope snapped. He called me into his office, and when I walked in, there it was, the small piece of paper Nadia had given me, lying on the desk like an accusation. A flimsy piece of paper, with a few words of hope, and yet, it weighed like dynamite. His face was calm, dangerously calm. "I saw a distance in you, Zara," he began, his voice controlled, cold. "A coldness in your eyes. I thought it was something fleeting, a daydream. But this," he pointed to the paper, "this comes from their book, the Book of the Infidels." I felt my body freeze. The moment I'd dreaded so much had finally arrived. I'd rehearsed it 1,000 times in silence, and yet, there before him, I felt small, vulnerable, a daughter before her own father's tribunal. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice rising now, his calmness slipping away. I could lie, say I found it on the street, that it was a mistake, that I was just curious, and in doing so, save my skin, my home, my family. But lying would be denying the only truth that had really given me life, and something in me new. To deny that would be to return to the desert, voluntarily. So, I took a deep breath, and with a fragile voice, almost a thread, I chose the truth. "It's real, Baba," I whispered. The emptiness I carried, he filled it. The peace I never found in prayer, I felt in that place. I heard about a man named Isa. He spoke of living water, and I drank. I tried to explain. I spoke of peace, of the love that doesn't charge, that doesn't demand anything before accepting. I tried to share the light I had found, but he didn't listen. Nothing from that. What he saw was betrayal. The mask of serenity shattered. In its place, a rage that wasn't just spiritual, it was personal. It wasn't just his faith that I had challenged. It was his authority, his name, his honor. The pain I saw in his eyes wasn't that of someone who had lost an argument, but of someone who felt they had lost their daughter. "You have brought shame upon this house," he shouted, his voice shaking the walls. "You spit in the graves of your ancestors. You threw away your soul for the stories of liars." He was shaking. So was I. The chasm between us, which had previously been only invisible, was now fully exposed. And even with my heart broken, I knew, too wouldn't go back. He grabbed me by the arm with a strength I never would have imagined coming from the man who had once lifted me onto his shoulders to watch the fireworks. His grip was iron, his fury ice. Without another word, he dragged me down the hallway, past my mother, standing there like a broken statue, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with panic and pain. She said nothing, not a sound, and that hurt more than any scream. He flung open the front door and, his eyes filled with a hatred I had never known, growled, "You're not my son. This is no longer your home. You are no longer my daughter." And then, bam, the door slammed shut with the force of a sentence. The sound of the bolt sliding into place sounded like a tombstone being sealed. I stood there, staring at the wood, waiting, for a miracle perhaps, for the door to open again, for my mother's hand to break through the fear and pull me back. But silence answered, cold, final. The night air was sharp. The ground beneath my feet was hard, but nothing hurt more than that rejection, because the emptiness I had known before, that of a dry soul, thirsting for God, was, in a way, silent. But this new emptiness was deafening. I wasn't just an orphan of faith, I was orphan of everything. I don't know how my feet started walking. I didn't think. I just went. The city slept, and I walked the streets like a shadow. Shame burned in my cheeks, mixed with the cold dawn wind. I trembled all over, not just from the cold, but from loss, from fear, from loneliness. Only one name came to mind, Nadia. I reached her door without knowing how. I knocked with weak knuckles. When she opened it and saw my face, swollen, wet with tears, stripped of any shield, she didn't ask anything. She simply pulled me inside. Her arms, thin and fragile, closed around me as if to keep me whole. In that cramped little room, for a few hours, we believed there might be a way. We spoke in low, anxious whispers. What if we left? What if we found Yusuf? What if there was a place where we could believe without fear? Dreams of two broken girls, trying to build a boat with their hands in the middle of a rough sea. We prayed, not with pretty words, not with memorized verses. We prayed like someone bleeding, sincere, broken, with our souls open. And there, even surrounded by fear, I felt that gentle warmth again, as if he were whispering, "I'm still here." But dawn did not come. Even before the first call to prayer echoed through the city's minarets, the sound of a drumbeat violent at the door stripped us of any illusion. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't family. It was the sound of authority, brutal, decisive, impatient. Our eyes met, and the instant before the door burst inward, I knew he finished. The room was invaded by large, hard-faced, bushy-bearded men wearing dark uniforms. They didn't look at us as people. They looked at us as threats, as something impure. They didn't speak with us. They spoke about us, as if we were objects, mistakes, traitors. Their voices were filled with contempt, as if every word burned them for speaking of something so filthy. Nadia's hand found mine, and squeezed. It was a small gesture, but it was the only thing keeping me from collapsing completely. They took us without giving us time to put anything else on, without explanation. They just dragged us out under the still dark sky, as if we were war criminals. That night, I left everything behind. My family, my name, my home. But I carried with me one thing that no one could take away, the name of the one who gave me living water. And even as the cars pulled away through the cold streets of Damascus, even as I was surrounded by hard faces and empty eyes, even as fear gnawed at my mind, a small flame inside me remained lit. Isa saw me. He was still with me. "Both of you," the man said, his gaze dismissing us both as trash. Me, the one who got lost, and Nadia, the one who brought me here. Chaos ensued. My arms were pulled back so hard I couldn't help but scream. I saw Nadia's mother sobbing, her father pleading in vain, their words swallowed by the men's harsh orders. And then, before I could say anything else, I felt a rough cloth being tied over my eyes, plunging me into a suffocating darkness. I was dragged, shoved into a vehicle that smelled of stale sweat and iron. The journey was a blur, full of jolts and muffled screams. When the hood was finally removed from my head, the white light of the room I found myself in seemed to burn me. A man, a stranger to me, sat behind a metal desk, leafing through papers disinterestedly, not even looking at me. "Name?" he asked, his voice emotionless. I said. He shook his head. "From now on, you are prisoner 734. He stamped a piece of paper, and that cold gesture struck me. The pearl I so desired already had too high a price. My name, my identity, ripped from me. When the heavy iron cell door slammed shut with a bang that echoed in the silence, I understood that this was only the first of many battles. Time lost its meaning in that small prison. There was no sun or moon, only a constant gloom coming through a high grate and the yellowish buzzing light of a lamp in the hallway. My life had been reduced to a simple, brutal cycle. Doors slamming, the metallic sound of a bowl scraping across the cold floor, and a crushing silence that weighed on my chest like a stone. The living, hopeful faith I'd felt in that little back room of the fabric store felt a million miles away. There, in that filthy cold, praying was like trying to scream into a pillow. The God who seemed so close, the father who ran to embrace his lost son, simply wasn't there. I was prisoner 734, a number on a list, swallowed by darkness. The pearl I'd imagined as treasure now felt like a cold, heavy stone stuck deep within me. In my haze of despair, I almost didn't realize I wasn't alone. In the darkest corner of the cell lay a mound of rags, barely moving. I assumed it was just another soul lost in that madness, and I was so consumed by my own sadness that I barely cared. Days, maybe weeks, passed. Then, one night when the light seemed even dimmer and the silence thicker, a hoarse, forgotten voice cut through the air. "He has not abandoned you." I shivered and slowly raised my head. The bundle of rags shifted, and a pair of large, dark, tired eyes fixed on me. Who are you?" I stammered, my voice hoarse and strange even to myself. "My name is Mina," she whispered, her tone carrying deep pain, but also hope. "I've been where you are now, at rock bottom, wondering if heaven was even real." Mina had been there for over a year. Her crime was the same as mine, believing in a love the state deemed illegal. She was the one who taught me the hard art of surviving in that place. She showed me how to curl up to conserve heat on the frozen ground, how to break stale bread into tiny pieces to make it last as long as possible. She taught me to listen for the guard's footsteps, to know when it was safe to whisper. Mina became my anchor in that sea of darkness, my sister in the shadows. Escape was never a word we dared utter. It seemed too cruel a hope to entertain. Instead, we spoke of home. She described her family's olive grove, the scent of rain falling on dry earth. I told her about the jasmine that bloomed in our courtyard in Damascus. We didn't sing those joyful songs I learned from Yusuf and his group. Our worship was quieter, fraught with despair, but also truer. It was the whisper of a hymn we remembered when one of us was taken away for interrogation. It was the silent, shared recitation of the shepherd's psalm, hands clasped in the dark. It was a simple yet profound gesture, sharing the larger piece of bread with another. Mina's faith didn't shine with its own light. It was an old, stubborn, worn shield that protected us. She taught me that God isn't just light and comfort. He's also the one who sits beside us in the dirt, in the darkness, holding our hand as our hearts break. One night, after a particularly cruel day, I was crying silently when she crawled to me and hugged me. In that moment, that fragile embrace felt more real and divine than any cathedral I had ever seen. The darkness was still a monster, but I was no longer alone to face it. I had a sister. The bond Mina and I forged there, in the shadows, became the foundation of our survival. But surviving in that place wasn't passivity. It was a daily battle, waged within the mind and body. The main battleground was the interrogations. They didn't have set times. They appeared whenever they pleased, usually in the dead of night, and dragged us from the relative safety of the cell to a cold, antiseptic white room. There were always two men, interchangeable faces, but with the same cruel, bored look. Their goal was clear: to rip from me the pearl I held tightly. Their methods were a symphony of cruelty. They began with false pleasantries. "Your father is a respected man, Zara," one of them said, leaning close to me. "He could have you out of here tomorrow. All you have to do is sign this paper, say the old prayers, admit you were foolish." They offered me a glass of clean water, a piece of fruit, simple wishes that made me ache, like a betrayal of my deepest self. When kindness failed, mockery followed. "And where is this Isa guy now?" They laughed, mocking my faith. "Is he there with you? Did he promise you a life of ease? Look at yourself, prisoner 734. Is this the abundant life he offered?" Each sentence was a blow, ripping away my faith, one question after another, trying to dismantle everything I believed in. In those early sessions, my courage was easily broken. I would return to the cell, shaking and crying, thinking that maybe they were right, that my faith was just a childish dream. But Mina was always there. In her simple way, she would wipe the dirt from my face with an old rag and tell stories of others who had resisted. "Fire serves to purify gold, not to destroy it," she said, her voice small, almost a whisper, but carrying immense power in the midst of the darkness. "Don't fight with their strength, fight with his strength." Before each new session, she made me repeat a verse, a promise to cling to with both hands, a firm rock in the middle of the raging river. "I will not leave you an orphan. I will come back to you." Slowly, I learned to create a small refuge inside my mind, a quiet room where no one could reach me. As the interrogators shouted, I hid inside, watching the faces of Yusuf's group singing those soft, hopeful songs. When they deprived me of sleep until I nearly passed out, I clung to the feeling of Mina's hand holding mine tightly, a reminder that I wasn't alone. Her taunts became just background noise, a buzzing of flies against the thick walls of my invisible sanctuary. My faith was changing. It was no longer a warm blanket to protect me. It was becoming armor, forged with every pain. I stopped asking for rescue. I started asking for strength to endure. The moment that changed everything was during one of those endless interrogations. I was weak, dizzy from hunger, my entire body screaming for rest. The man interrogating me stood over me, his face etched with frustration. "It's over 7:34. No one's coming to save you. Where's your God now?" he shouted, his voice echoing coldly in the white room. And in that instant, a strange calm washed over me. The fear vanished, giving way to a certainty that seemed to come from outside myself. I looked up, and looking directly into his eyes, whispered firmly, "He's here." He stood frozen for a second, before furiously punching me in the face. As they dragged me back to the cell, the pain in my cheek throbbed, but inside me, something had changed. The fire trying to consume me was shaping me. For the first time, I believed I could indeed survive. Life in the cell fell into a grim, repetitive rhythm. Dark days, meager rations, and the terror of interrogation ever present. Mina and I were a small nation of two, with our whispered psalms and silences that spoke volumes, until a new sound began to invade our world. First, a low, distant growl, a vibration we felt more in our bones than heard with our ears. As the days passed, that distant growl grew louder, like a constant drumbeat that marked the rhythm of our prison life. It was the sound of Damascus falling apart. The war, once a distant news, was now there, knocking on our door, invading every corner of that place. The guards began to grow restless, their cruelty mingled with a fear that seemed to hurt more than any scream. On this particular night, the air was heavy, charged with a tension that made hearts race for no apparent reason. The bombardment began shortly after dinner, closer, more violent than ever. The stone floor beneath our feet trembled, as if alive and frightened. The single light in the hallway flickered frantically and went out, plunging everything into a darkness so dense it seemed almost palpable. Dust and sand fell from the ceiling, while the desperate screams of prisoners and guards mingled in a deafening chaos. Mina and I clung to each other like two small boats struggling to stay afloat in the midst of the storm. There were no words in our prayers, only the rapid beating of our hearts, trying to find each other in the midst of the hurricane. And then, amidst the tumult, a sound that seemed all too strange for that moment, the grinding of a key in a lock. The heavy door swung open with a sigh, and a figure stood out against the orange fire that illuminated the courtyard. It wasn't one of the cruel guards we were used to. It was a young man named Bilal, one of those who always avoided eye contact and barely spoke. His face, lit by the fire, was so fearful it almost hurt. He wasn't here to hurt us. "Go," he whispered, his voice breaking. "There's a breach in the west wall near the kitchens. Now." He looked at me, then at Mina, and for a moment, the guard's mask fell, and I saw only a terrified boy. "My sister. She's your age," he stammered, as if that explained everything. "May God have mercy on us." Without waiting for an answer, he turned and disappeared into the chaos, an unexpected angel who appeared and disappeared in the midst of hell. We stood frozen for a moment, doubt freezing us. What if it was a trap? But true fear told us this was a chance, a gap between despair and hope. We chose hope. With legs weak from months of imprisonment, stumbling more than running, we hurled ourselves through the destroyed corridors. Broken stone, twisted iron, moans of pain all around. It all seemed part of a nightmare that wouldn't end. The smoke burned our lungs, and Mina, weaker, nearly fell. I caught her, pulling her forward, her arm resting on my shoulder. We were no longer two girls. We were one desperate force fighting against the grave. We found the breach, just as he'd said. A jagged opening, an M carved into the thick stone wall, opening into the cold night. We stepped over rubble and broken bricks, and suddenly, we were outside. The city before us was a chaotic scene, the sky painted with flames, the sound of destruction continuing like a terrifying symphony. But there that night, that vision was not the end. It was the beginning of our escape, and of our faith, tested in the fires of adversity. But the air that filled our lungs, heavy with smoke and fear, tasted different. It was the air of freedom. We were no longer prisoners. We were fugitives. The freedom we felt there, outside the prison walls, carried with it an invisible poison. We had left the cell, yes, but to enter a much larger prison, an entire city consumed by fire and chaos. The instinct that had guided us through the destroyed corridors now screamed for us to flee, away from Damascus. Mina, leaning against my shoulder, her breath short and raspy, pointed south. "Jordan," she said, almost like a distant dream. "We have to try to reach the border." It seemed madness. 2 ghosts in dirty rags, hungry, thirsty, bodies that had been left to starve for months. But still, it was a direction, a purpose. Under that smoke-choked sky, we began our pilgrimage. We became creatures of the night, moving silently through the rubble of villages and dry fields, hiding during the day among ruins and shallow ditches, praying no one would find us. The wild was a cruel, merciless master. Hunger became an open wound that ached unceasingly. Thirst, a fire that burned my throat, making every sip impossible. I even drank dirty water from a puddle, tasting its bitterness as if it were the sweetest of nectars. We ate bitter leaves and roots, always praying they wouldn't poison us. It was a constant struggle, unlike the one in the cell, a duel between the spirit and the brutal cruelty of life, and between the body and the indifferent silence of the world. Our faith, which in prison was armor against pain, was now the only nourishment for our souls. Before, we prayed for the strength to endure. Now we prayed to be able to take just one more step, to find a pool of water, a shade to rest in, a moment of peace without the fear of discovery. There were days when hope seemed to fade, so faint it almost disappeared. I remember fainting in the middle of an abandoned olive grove, under the scorching sun, and telling Mina that I couldn't walk another inch. I was ready to surrender to that cruel nature. But she, as fragile as she seemed, knelt beside me and began to tell the story of Isa, of the man who fed multitudes with a few loaves and fishes. Her voice was barely audible, but in that desolation, that story was a true miracle. That thread of hope lifted me, and little by little, it appeared, subtle and unexpected. One night we found a small, isolated farmhouse that seemed miraculously untouched. An elderly woman, her face etched with pain and strength, saw us hiding near the well. We trembled, expecting screams, punishment, or worse. But instead, she beckoned us closer, without asking our names, without demanding stories. She saw only what truly mattered, our need. She offered us what little she had, a piece of dark, dense bread, 2 hard-boiled eggs, and filled our hands with fresh water from her well. She didn't need to say a word. Her quiet kindness spoke louder than any sermon I'd ever heard. In that simple gesture, I saw a beacon amidst the madness, proof that even in a broken world, humanity still exists, a refuge of compassion. It was this small act that gave us the strength to carry on, even when our strength was already drained. We continued on, crossing a rocky plain, where the land seemed to open up into a desert of solitude, until, one night, we reached the top of a low hill and saw, in the distance, a bright light. Not a city, but the searchlights of the Jordanian border. A gate, the promise of an end to this wild journey. We fell to our knees right there, not in joy, but in sheer exhaustion, the weight of the pilgrimage crushing our bones. We had been through so much, survived against all odds, and now finally, we stood before salvation. The descent down that hill to the gate was a strange, almost unreal moment, as if we were leaving a part of ourselves behind. Amidst the crowds gathering near the border, we were swallowed up by a sea of lost people, all with stories of pain etched in their eyes. It wasn't just Mina and me anymore. We were a wave of desperate souls trying to make a new beginning. The guards, tired and overwhelmed, welcomed us with the basics: a blanket, hot, sweet tea that made me want to cry. We were registered again, my name reappearing on a piece of paper, no longer a cold number, but a sign that there was still hope. By bus, we were taken to a vast field of white tents, stretching as far as the eye could see, under a merciless sun, the Zatari refugee camp. We emerged from the storm but entered a different desert, a place made of dust, tarps, and broken memories. There, among thousands, I felt the weight of loneliness as never before. In prison, Mina and I were one soul, intertwined by suffering and struggle. But in the camp, the tension that held us together began to dissolve, and little by little, she drifted away, reuniting with a cousin, and, with her, part of the life she had left behind. The sister who held my hand in the darkness disappeared, and for the first time, I felt the deepest loneliness, even surrounded by crowds. The emptiness I'd felt since I was a girl in Damascus returned, colder and more weary than ever. I'd asked God for deliverance, and was thrown into a refugee camp. I'd asked for strength, and found myself adrift, lost in a sea of unfamiliar faces, trying to find a place to call home. On a hot, sweltering afternoon, when everything seemed too heavy, I was drawn to a soft corner that escaped a tent unlike any other. The only thing that distinguished it was a simple, hand-painted wooden cross hanging from its flap. My heart, which I thought had been hardened forever, leaped strangely at the sight of that cross. I stood there hesitant, my hand almost touching the canvas, torn between ancient fear and an urgent desire to find some refuge. I finally entered. The heat continued, but the air inside the tent was so peaceful it seemed to embrace the soul. A small group of people sat on plastic chairs, listening to an older man, a Jordanian with a serene face and a calm voice. He spoke not of punishments, but of a garden, of a God who walks side by side with his children in the morning freshness. When the sermon ended, a foreign woman with warm blue eyes and a gentle smile approached. Her name tag said Sarah. She offered me a glass of water and asked my name with genuine curiosity. When I said Zara, she repeated it as if the word were a treasure, not just any name. That simple act, being seen as a person, unique and valuable, began to unlock the bars of that invisible prison I still carried inside. That place, that small canvas church, led by Pastor Elias and a dedicated group of volunteers, became my safe haven. The women who frequented the tent, each carrying their own wounds, became my sisters in faith and struggle. We cooked, cried, and prayed together. It wasn't the urgent, desperate bond I had with Mina, forged in the terror of prison. It was different. It was calmer, more solid. It was the beginning of a family, the beginning of a real home. The welcome of Pastor Elias and these women was a shield against the harshness of the camp. But I soon realized that no wall, no matter how cozy, could protect my heart from the prison it itself carried. My days took on a new rhythm, helping with the tent chores, learning English with Sarah, sharing meals with those who understood what it was like to lose almost everything. But the nights, the nights were the real challenge. I would wake in a cold sweat, feeling as if my father's metallic grip still held my arm. I could see the cruel faces of my interrogators projected into the darkness of the tent. The peace I felt during the day was like a thin, fragile layer of ice over a deep, turbulent sea of hurt. And that fragile peace shattered one Sunday morning. Pastor Elias spoke about forgiveness, not as a pretty word, but as a necessary surgery on the soul. He said that holding a grudge is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. Each word he spoke was a stone thrown into that turbulent sea within me, creating waves that I'm still learning to calm. How could I forgive? The word felt like a betrayal to the girl who had been tortured inside cell 734. Forgiving felt like accepting everything my father had done, justifying the brutality of those guards. The anger I carried was my shield, my sacred fire, what kept me standing when everything around me seemed to be falling apart. Forgiving would mean giving up my only defense and letting injustice win. For days, I avoided Pastor Elias and Sarah because this thought burned inside me. The anger wasn't just against those who hurt me. Now, it was even against them for asking something so impossible of me. Until one afternoon, Sarah found me sitting alone, watching the dust dance in the air between the tents. She didn't try to convince me with words. She just sat beside me, a silent presence that questioned me unhurriedly. That's when I finally broke. The words came out in a flood of pain and anger. "They don't deserve this," I choked out. "My father discarded me like trash. Those men tried to destroy my soul. How can you ask me to forgive that?" She listened to me, unafraid, her blue eyes filled with a compassion unshaken by my fury. "You're right, Zara," she said softly. "They don't deserve it. But forgiveness isn't about what they deserve. It's about what you deserve. You deserve to be free from them. They're not here, but you carry them inside you every day." Those words were a seed that began to grow inside me. That night, with trembling hands, I took the paper and pen Sarah had given me and began to write. Not a letter to my father, but to my younger sister Aisha, the one who had watched, silent and terrified, as I was expelled. My first draft was full of venom, full of pain, accusations, and fury. I tore it all up. The second was cold, a detailed account of suffering, like a legal document. I tore it up too. I sat there, thinking not of the monster who rejected me, but of the man who once taught me to fly a kite, a man trapped in a fortress of fear and distorted honor. I thought of Aisha, torn between her love for me and her loyalty to her father. My last letter was simple, without accusations, without easy forgiveness. It said, "My dear Aisha, by a miracle I am alive and safe. There are still nights when I feel imprisoned, and days when I feel the pain of expulsion, but I am learning to be free. And that freedom begins now. I choose to forgive. I hope one day you will understand. I love you, Zara." I folded the letter, knowing I might never send it, but that didn't matter. Writing those words, difficult, impossible, was like turning a key in a rusty lock inside me. The chains on my heart haven't lifted, but for the first time, I feel them lift. It's been over a year since Mina and I stumbled from the jungle to this tent city. The dust of Zatari camp has woven itself into the fabric of my life, and the rhythm of this place now lulls me. I still live in a simple tent, but it's no longer just a shelter. It's a home. The community Pastor Elias and Sarah built here became the fertile ground where my broken roots began to take hold again. Today, I spend my days as Sarah spent hers when I arrived, welcoming incoming families, helping with translations for humanitarian workers, and sitting with women whose eyes carry the same haunted emptiness I once recognized in my own mirror. I offer them tea, ask their names, and listen to their stories. I carry my past with me. I always will. There are marks on my body, scars that now shine like silver lines, and scars on my soul that only I can see. For a long time, I saw these marks as symbols of shame, cruel reminders of what was ripped from me. I would touch that thin line on my cheek where the interrogator's ring left its mark and feel a burning rage rise from within. But the path of forgiveness, that difficult and painful heart surgery, changed everything. Today, when I look at these scars, I see something different. They are not just proof of my pain. They are the map of my liberation, the testimony etched within me. This pain was a forge, and hope found a way to grow even in the driest soil. My scars tell my story, but the story is not just mine. It is his story. My father's face still appears sometimes in my dreams, but the anger is gone. Now I see a man who perhaps deserves my compassion, a different prisoner, trapped in a cage of honor and fear. I pray for him, for my mother, for Aisha. I pray for Mina, wherever she is, and for Bal, the young guard who chose a rare moment of mercy. I understand that my story is not unique. She is one among millions, a thread woven into the painful tapestry of my people, of a world groaning in its pain. But it is the story I have been entrusted to tell, and I tell it, not as a tale of my strength, but as a testament to the love that found me when I was lost, that sat with me in the darkness of my prison, that guided me through the desert, and that now teaches me true freedom. My purpose isn't just to survive. It's to be a shelter, however small, for other boats lost in the storm, to be a gentle voice that whispers, "He has not abandoned you," to another soul drowning in silence. The future is a vast and unknown sea. I don't know if I'll ever leave this camp, if I'll ever feel the Syrian earth beneath my feet again. But the fear has vanished. The empty throne in my heart is occupied. And the king who now sits there is not a distant tyrant, but a loving father, a shepherd who bears the scars of his own journey to rescue his sheep. And that is a story worth telling.